So we have done a playthrough with every type of spell across all the Souls games, and that even included a Sekiro prosthetic run and a Bloodborne 100 tools only run. So we are going to talk about all of these and rank them from worst to best, which I kind of have already done something similar with these videos. They were just separated into different categories, and the criteria valued things like variety, synergy with other builds, and how fun they actually are to use. But for this video, the criteria is based on how well they perform in their own respective game. So it's not necessarily which spell type is the best or gets the best damage, it's just how good they are in their own game. Anyway, this actually might end up being a longer one, so let's just get into it. Starting off right at the bottom as the worst spell type across all the Souls games, we have the Elden Ring tools, which yes, they're not technically spells, but if we're going to include Bloodborne tools onto this list, we're going to include the Elden Ring ones too. Now, Bloodborne is basically the reason as to why these are actually in the game. Elden Ring felt like a culmination of all the Souls games combined, and they wanted to just add something from every single game. And for Bloodborne, I guess they decided to add the tools. The spells are basically the equivalents. Like, I don't understand why they just weren't just made as spells. They would have just been so much better because these things do terrible damage. Doesn't matter how many points you have into your elemental stats, they're just still going to perform worse than every other spell in the entire game. And it's gotten to the point that I think even Fromsoft forget these actually exist because they haven't ever received a single buff. They've just always been trash. Now, there aren't many tools in total. There's only 4 or 5 if you include the one that's actually cut content, which that one sucks too. And it's not like every single one of these is actually useless. The Wraith Calling Bell is going to be like the only one that's really useful, because it does have some good synergy with the retaliation weapon skills. But as for everything else, I struggle to really find a use for these. I mean, the good things about them is that they're actually items, so you actually can like equip them on the go and just use them whenever you feel like, and they're not going to take up any spell slots. So if you actually wanted like a projectile based option that just consumed a little bit of FP just to like bait enemies in one at a time, that might be useful, but they're just so bad that I could never really justify using them or even going out of your way to try and acquire them. Which if these things just sucked and they were just out of the way, that would be fine. But the most egregious offense of this is that the Regal Omen ban, this item right here, is a remembrance item. It's taking up a whole remembrance slot from the Morgoth remembrance, which this one could have easily been another incantation. It could have been like a big ass holy hammer incantation, but no, we got this thing instead. He doesn't even use this attack. It could have just been a spell anyway. Probably would have been pretty cool. Might have done some nice damage. But even at like 99 intelligence and faith, they still perform terribly. Number 16, we have Demon Souls Miracles, which this spell type definitely got the short end of the stick when it comes to the spells in this game. At least these ones are actually somewhat useful, but the reason why they're going to get lower on the list is because there's only one damaging option in God's Wrath, which this one is kind of like your Wrath of the Gods from the other games, but it just consumes way too much MP, does terrible damage, very long animation that you can get staggered out of pretty quickly too. So basically the only spells you really have with the Demon Souls Miracles are your healing spells and your status effect curing spells and Second Chance, which Second Chance is basically like the only thing that you really want to use. Maybe that and like the recovery or regeneration spell. Because in terms of the rest of the spells, you can basically do all of these exact same things with just regular items that you can buy for souls, which yeah, obviously is going to end up costing souls, but the alternative is actually using spells that cost MP, and the way to replenish the MP is by buying items that cost souls as well, so there's not really much of an incentive there. So just buying the item is just going to be more convenient because you don't have to worry about just speccing into more intelligence to get more spell slots. Now in terms of the rest of the spells that they do have, it's just basically stuff for like online and PvP. Now being that this is actually a PvE based list, not going to really take those into consideration, and Demon Souls PvP is kind of just dead nowadays anyway. Number 15, we have the Sekiro prosthetic tools. Now, all of these are actually somewhat useful. They'll have their own very specific niche uses, but they actually can be pretty good, especially when it comes to things like the Firecracker or the Umbrella. These can definitely trivialize a lot of different encounters and boss fights. Something like the Shuriken can be really good at fighting dogs. The Flame Vent is a nice way to proc burn, or even potentially buff your weapon when you have it upgraded, which I guess is like one of the few problems that I actually have with the Sekiro prosthetics, is that the upgrading system and the path to actually get better types of tools is just completely obnoxious. It requires a bunch of farming, gathering a bunch of different types of materials from different locations, sometimes even doing like annoying quest lines just to get even more stuff, which I guess isn't too bad, but unfortunately you're required to actually grab a bunch of different materials for all the different types of prosthetic tools if you want to upgrade the thing that you actually want to upgrade. Let's just say you really want to use the Flame Vent and actually have the Lazarlight Sacred Flame upgrade. Just to get to it, you have to upgrade your Umbrella and your Divine Abduction, and have to upgrade these things multiple times as well. It's like, why do I have to go spend all these materials and farm for these materials just to upgrade something that I'm not even going to use to upgrade the thing that I want to use? It just feels very out of the way and just like there to punish the player. But for me, the worst thing about these prosthetic tools is that they consume spirit emblems, which is not too bad, but combat arts also consume spirit emblems. And they're just like better to have like 90% of the time. You're just better off using combat arts. The tools are just very situational and just very much secondary based options. So you're better off spending the finite amount of spirit emblems that you have just doing combat arts instead, because more times than not, they're just going to be doing more posture damage. Which this wouldn't be too bad if there was actually a decent way to replenish spirit emblems, but the only way to do it is via the ceremonial tanto. And for whatever reason, this item was decided to be dropped off a random mini boss, a very annoying mini boss in a random location. I don't know why this wasn't given to us like right at the beginning of the game, because this basically works the exact same way blood bullets work in Bloodborne, and that you stab yourself to just give yourself some more bullets, but it drains a bit of your health. This is kind of the exact same thing. It drains your health and actually gives you +5 to your spirit emblems. But the difference is that in Bloodborne, not only do you start off with it as a part of your base kit, but it only drains 30% of your health, and you have 20 blood vials that you start off with right at the beginning of the game to counteract this as well. And when you take into account that you actually can pick up blood vials off enemies along the way, and the rally mechanic, it actually becomes pretty consistent to be able to replenish your blood vials. But in Sekiro, the Tanto drains 50% of your health, and the only way that you actually can heal yourself to counteract that is via your main healing item, the Gourd, of which you only get 10 uses of it. And it's not like you start off with 10, you're actually probably going to get 10 like towards the later half of the playthrough. And you also get 3 pellets as well. So despite a lot of these actually being powerful and pretty useful, the fact that they were just seen as secondary options and not really fully fleshed out definitely hurts their potential. Number 14, we have Dark Souls 1 Miracles, which these are definitely an upgrade over the Demon Souls Miracles, because at least you have some damaging options, even though like every single one of these spells is acquired off a Covenant, which can be pretty annoying, especially if you're trying to get it in offline. But worse yet, some of these spells require you to be in the Covenants just to do good damage. And even worse than that, some of the spells require you to be in the Covenant even if you just want to use them. Now the damaging spells themselves, they're decent. You can definitely beat the entire game only using miracles. I did it. It wasn't that bad, but they're definitely not going to be anywhere near as good as Pyromancies or Sorceries in Dark Souls 1. Stuff like Lightning Spear, Gravelord Sword Dance, they're okay, they're not too bad. Your best damaging spells are going to be Sunlight Spear and Wrath of the Gods, of which Sunlight Spear is only acquired in New Game Plus because you get it off the final boss. And Wrath of the Gods only has like 3 casts, so you're basically just going to use it in like a boss fight, most likely kill the boss anyway. Now these are miracles, so they are going to have access to support types of spells, which Sunlight's Blade and Darkmoon Blade are just going to be must-haves in almost every single type of build where you actually want to buff your weapon. Just meeting the requirements for these spells is just going to add a bunch more damage. Now unfortunately you only get 1 cast, so it's only going to really be for a boss fight. And when it comes to the healing based spells, the game gives you 20 flasks, like you don't really need any more heals than that, honestly. You're not dying because you run out of heals in this game, you die because you get comboed to death. That's basically it. So in a PvE setting, I think the healing spells are somewhat useless, except for the health regen ones, they're pretty cool. So yeah, for the most part, these are very mediocre. Number 13, we have the Bloodborne Hunter Tools, which these are actually all very solid options. These are definitely underused, and I guess the reason as to why that's the case is because they're all doing arcane damage and have an arcane type of scaling, except for a couple of them, and the arcane damage type is just not going to be that great for like most of the game. Some cases it's actually really good, but then like the rest of it is like completely doo-doo trash. But I guess the main reason is that there's only a couple weapons in this game that actually have an arcane scaling, so not many people actually go into an arcane scaling to actually utilize these tools. And some of these are actually honestly amazing. Something like Augur of Abridus is very cheap. Only 1 bullet does some nice damage. You can actually parry and backstab with it. It does send enemies flying and can actually trivialize a bunch of the different bosses in the game. This tool just completely destroyed Maria. Tools like Executioner's Gloves and the Call Beyond are very nice projectile options, although using them against like more mobile types of enemies means you're probably gonna miss. And combined with the fact that they're pretty expensive means you're not going to really use them as much outside of a couple boss fights, which I guess I really wouldn't be using them outside of boss fights anyway, due to a lot of them being somewhat expensive, and you're going to have to like keep using a bunch of blood bullets and keep draining your blood vials, which can get somewhat annoying, but it definitely is a lot more viable than what it actually is in Sekiro. You do also have a tool in the Tiny Tonatress, which is going to be like the only one that doesn't do arcane damage, which is kind of unfortunate. I wish there was more that did different types of damage, especially like a fire-based one that definitely needed one of those. But unfortunately, this one is only really going to be good against enemies that are weaker to lightning because it is pretty expensive. But in terms of your best damaging options, they're basically going to be in the DLC. The Black Sky Eye and the Cursed Brew are actually very solid projectile options, very cheap, and actually do some large amounts of damage. But yeah, once again, they're actually going to be somewhat into the DLC, not going to be the easiest things to acquire. But there are going to be some support types of tools that actually are somewhat useful. The Empty Phantasm Shell is going to be an arcane buff. It's pretty cheap, and being that there's no like arcane paper in this game, it definitely has lots of uses. The Old Hunter Bone is actually pretty nice for your neutral game. It just enhances your dodge, but it actually is pretty expensive. So pairing it alongside builds that don't really utilize bullets is probably going to be much more beneficial. And Martyr's Whistle is going to be your lone blood tinge tool. I don't know why this thing actually does arcane damage and actually have a blood tinge scaling. This actually can be pretty high damaging, but it is situational due to how it actually does track towards the enemy. But I think the actually most underrated part about these tools is that they actually don't have a soft cap. You can just go all the way to 99 and actually still benefit and get amazing damage at that level. So it definitely is going to be something more for like later in the game, because earlier on, there aren't actually that many options that are available to you. And being that in most cases, you're always better off just using your weapons to just do good damage anyway. So they kind of serve as just like secondary situational types of tools, but they definitely can cheese a lot of bosses. Number 12, we have Dark Souls 2 Pyromancies. Now, this is basically where the list just starts to get really good. You can't go wrong with any of these options from here on out. But I'm just going to put Dark Souls 2 lower on the list because I think it's just the worst spell type in this game. Just purely based on performance, the other ones are just going to be much better. Now, the main use for Pyromancies in this game is probably going to be for like lower level builds, or just to have a projectile based option when you don't have Faith or Intelligence spec'd into at all, because these things actually don't have requirements, and most of your damage is actually going to come off actually upgrading your Pyromancy Flame, kind of similar to how it is in Dark Souls 1, just like not as broken though, definitely a lot more balanced. And in terms of all the options here, they're all pretty decent, but like there's nothing that's like really amazing. Outside of like Poison Mist and Toxic Mist, these things are just ridiculous. Almost everything in the entire game can be poisoned and toxic, and it just does so much damage every time. You could put these on like any type of build and just straight up benefit as well. The same thing could also be said about Warmth, but in terms of the rest of your damaging based spells, they're not going to be that great. Stuff like Firestorm or Chaos Storm is a complete downgrade from what it was in Dark Souls 1 and Demon Souls. Great Combustion can do some nice damage, but it consumes a lot of stamina. And in terms of your best projectile options like Great Chaos Fireball or Forbidden Sun, these are actually really good and high damaging, but you only get like such few amounts of casts. You only get 2 casts for Great Chaos Fireball and only 1 cast of Forbidden Sun, and you need to be like over 90 attunement just to get 3 casts. I don't know why the game just gives you such little amounts, especially because like the DLC bosses are just completely elemental resist, so you actually need like dozens of Forbidden Suns just to be able to kill a boss, because it just does not work over there. Which, speaking of the DLC, actually does add some more cool different types of spells. Outcry can actually be a pretty decent spell despite it being the most annoying thing to try and acquire, and these are classified as like Dark Flame sorceries but don't do dark damage, and it's like the only game where like the Black Flame spells just do pure fire damage and like nothing else. So if you end up going against bosses that are resist to fire, you don't really have an alternative option. So these spells are very viable and they can be pretty decent, but they're definitely a far cry from the rest of the options that Dark Souls 2 has to offer. Number 11, we have a Dark Souls 3 Pyromancies, which I see these very similar to how I see the Dark Souls 2 Pyromancies. They're still very viable, they can be very fun, and they have good synergy with other types of builds, but being that synergy and fun is not part of the criteria, and just based on performance, I'm not going to be able to put these ones higher on the list because the other spell types just perform better. But the reason it's still going to get higher than Dark Souls 2 is because at least your best spell can be casted more than like 3 or 4 times, because you do have an FP bar. And you also have differing stuff outside of just fire damage. Boulder Heave is like literally the best pyromancy in the entire game. This thing just absolutely decimates and destroys larger bosses' health bar, ends their poise meter too. And you also just get stuff for dark damage, which is obviously going to be nice when you go up against a boss that is going to be resist to fire damage. But in terms of like the rest of the options that Dark Souls 3 has to offer, they're just completely mediocre. They're very fun, but just either mediocre, trash, or just very situational. Number 10, we have a Dark Souls 2 Miracles, and I really want to put this one higher on the list. I really want to, because this is my favorite spell type in the entire game. But in good conscience, I just cannot, because early game, these things are just really bad. And it's 100% due to the fact that they just nerfed the casts that you get with Lightning Spear, Great Lightning Spear, and Sunlight Spear. The fact that your earliest spell and Lightning Spear only has 3 casts is just egregious. Especially when you compare it to all the other spell types, where their basic spell gets like upwards of 20 casts sometimes. But if you do use the attunement glitch and give yourself some more casts, Miracles are easily the best spell type in Dark Souls 2, because 1, lightning damage is absolutely amazing in this game. Almost everything in the game is weak to it and hardly anything is resist. He also does get like the best projectile options in Sunlight Spear. This spell just goes so incredibly far, does a lot of damage. Heavenly Thunder is a very nice AoE that is very good at melting larger bosses because it can hit multiple times, which compared to some of the other spells in the game like Chaos Storm, this is like another type of spell that works the same way, but that one doesn't hit the boss multiple times. this one does. And also the healing spells in this game are just going to be more useful than they are in Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 3 because kind of to do with the Estus Flask just like sucking in general. So it kind of just gives them more of a use. Sunlight Blade is very useful. Denial is obviously going to be really good to have. Wrath of the Gods kind of suck in this game, but at least the rest of the spells are all pretty good, despite some of them being acquired off covenants. But yeah, if the lightning based spells that had more casts, they would easily be a lot higher in this list. Number 9, we have Dark Souls 3 Miracles, which this is like the exact same thing as Dark Souls 2 Miracles. I feel the exact same way. If it was just better earlier in the game, this thing would be instantly top 5. I'm not even lying. Because unfortunately, early game, the only spell that you can really acquire is Lightning Spear, which is pretty cheap and you can cast it a whole bunch, but it definitely doesn't do as much damage. The run basically only starts until after you kill Abyss Watchers to where you can get Lightning Stake, which is only a couple bosses in, but for most people it's pretty much the easiest thing to do early game. But once you do acquire Lightning Stake, it's basically just a smooth playthrough because this thing is such a high damaging spell. It is close range, but you compare it alongside the poise boosting talismans, and it's just a GG at that point because after that you get access to the dark based miracles, which something like Dory's Gnawing is absolutely insane. This thing procs bleed so incredibly fast, and you could just melt bosses with larger health pools really quickly, and you can basically just use these 2 spells throughout the entire game, and you will really start to notice you get overpowered as soon as you kill Freda and grab the Rose of Ariandel, because that's just going to be 30% more miracle damage, and combined with all the other rings that you get in the game that boost your miracle damage by a lot, you can just end up getting way more damage than you can compared to Dark Souls 2 Miracles. I definitely recommend trying to kill Solar Cinder early so you can get Sunlight Spear, which is nice because it's like the only game where you can actually get Sunlight Spear outside of a Covenant, which I do appreciate. But speaking of Covenants, unfortunately there are going to be some spells like Sacred Oath and Great Lightning Spear that do require some Covenant farming, which the Covenant farming in this game is definitely harder than it is in Dark Souls 2. So that's going to be one thing that Dark Souls 2 does do better, and probably some of the support spells too, like the healing spells that is going to be more useful in Dark Souls 2. Probably outside of Projected Heal, that healing spell is actually kind of insane. But something like Tears of Denial is actually much more useful in this game compared to its Dark Souls 2 counterpart, because it is a lot cheaper and is like more accessible for like almost any type of build. But Dark Souls 2 Miracles do slightly suffer from like the Dark Souls 3 Pyromancy problem in that there's a lot of like mediocre options. Something like Way of Right Corona. Basically all of the dark based miracles, except for Dory's Gnawing, is kind of mid. Divine Pillars of Light is not that good either. Thankfully, Wrath of the Gods is a lot better than its Dark Souls 2 counterpart, but it's definitely not going to be as good as Dark Souls 1's Wrath of the Gods. So yeah, I love the miracles in Dark Souls 3, but if they just had a better starting option, that would be a lot higher. Number 8, we have Dark Souls 2 Hexes. Okay, let's keep in mind, this is not taking PvP into account. And let's also remember that Dark Souls 2 spells got major nerfs, Hexes in particular. If it was before the nerfs, all the Dark Souls 2 options would be much higher in the list, but it's just not the case. And also, I'm just going to mention again for the people that skip ahead in the video, we're not taking fun into account. It's not a part of the criteria. Because if we did, it'd probably be a lot higher because Dark Greatsword is like my favorite spell in this game. I love Dark Greatsword so much. Fantastic spell. But to get into the stuff that makes Hexes good, Dark Orb, Dark Hail, Dark Fog, you get all these spells very early on. They're very cheap. You get plenty of casts. You get multiple copies per playthrough. You do good damage. Dark Fog is a poison spell, and I've already talked about how good poison is. Now for Dark Souls 2 Hexes, you do have 2 separate categories. You have ones for your staffs and you have one for your chimes, which the staff-based ones tend to be better early on in the game because you do get your best staff early on. And the chime-based ones are probably better for later in the playthrough when you end up getting your best chime, especially because your best damaging ones like Great Resonant Soul and Climax actually consume a whole bunch of souls every single time that you do cast it. So you probably want to be later in the playthrough for that. So yeah, these things are just very easy to use and can be very high damaging. But the problem, and the biggest problem that I have with Hexes, is that they're so incredibly inconvenient that it's not even funny. Starting off with the fact that yes, you need to actually upgrade both a chime and a staff if you actually want to use all the spells. The fact that a lot of these spells take up so many slots, like almost every single spell takes up 2, sometimes even 3, and some of them even 4 slots, which is just absolutely ridiculous. The requirements for some of these things are just way too high. They can be in like the 40s and the 50s, sometimes even 40 and 50 of both Faith and Intelligence. The fact that Hexes scale off the lowest stat between Faith and Intelligence is stupid. I don't know why it just doesn't scale off both. And honestly, like half the Hexes in this game are just completely like mediocre or just like meant for PvP. They're just not really worth it in my opinion. But the biggest killer is the amount of slots that they actually take up. If they only like took up like just 1 or 2 for most of them, I'd probably like put them much higher in the list. But Hex builds require such high stat investment. But when I actually am in like the DLC where I actually am at a higher level, I would just rather go with the Hexes over all the other spell types, because all the other spell types kind of just do like doo-doo damage in the DLC, but the Hexes actually don't. They're actually pretty good there. So yeah, I have been critical of the Hexes, but they're obviously still going to make your playthrough incredibly easy. Number 7, we have the Dark Souls 2 Sorceries. Now, as I just mentioned with the Hexes, Yes, I'm going to prefer those ones for the DLC because, yeah, the Dark Souls 2 sorceries kind of perform like doo-doo trash in the DLC. But for the regular base game, I'm just going to prefer these ones a lot more because they can honestly be just as good, if not better, and they're just much more convenient to build around, to where you can actually have many different spells equipped and lots of casts of those spells too. You get so many projectile options right at the beginning of the game, and you can acquire many different copies for these spells too. Even stuff like Soulspear you can actually get somewhat early on, and you actually can farm this. Like one of your best spells, you can actually farm and get so many copies of this and just keep spamming it over and over again, then goes through enemies, does so much damage. And Crystal Soulspear you can also get somewhat earlier into the playthrough. It does require a bonfire aesthetic and New Game Plus, but it definitely is worth it because it is very high damaging. Soul Geyser is a nice way to just melt larger bosses in general. Now, there are going to be some mediocre options as always, with like Homing Soul Mass is just not as good as it was in Dark Souls 1. Homing Soul Arrow isn't that good either. Soul Bolt, Soul Shower, Focus Souls, these spells are pretty fun, but like they're just mid. But the biggest separator for me that put Dark Souls 2 sorceries over Dark Souls 2 hexes is not only that all of these spells only take up one slot compared to like 2 or 3 slots, and the fact they have a lot less requirements, but Unleash Magic is a spell that exists, which yes, does take up lots of slots and have high requirements, but this is basically a must-have when it comes to the DLC and New Game Plus because it just results in much more damage. You don't really need this type of spell for the base game because you can still get amazing damage even without this, but at least this spell does make the DLC somewhat possible and bearable, because without it, it would probably be a terrible experience. Number 6, we have Dark Souls 3 sorceries. Look, whether we like it or not, sorceries are just going to be the best spell type on average. They're just always going to be good, which I don't like that. I don't really care for the color blue. I think all these spells tend to be kind of boring for the most part. I'd much rather have things like lightning and fire. That's just me. But it doesn't change the fact that these are just objectively going to be better. From start to finish, they just always outperform all the other spell types. And for Dark Souls 3, this one performs very similar to like the Dark Souls 2 sorceries. I think the first half is going to be easier with Dark Souls 2, but once you get to the second half, Dark Souls 3 probably becomes easier, especially in the DLC. And that's not to say that the first half actually performs poorly. They actually still perform perfectly fine, because you do get some very good damaging based options. Pretty early on, they don't really cost that much. And obviously you have an FP bar, you can just spam them over and over again. Now, it is Dark Souls 2, so therefore there has to be a bunch of like really cool spells that just completely suck, like Farron Dart, Homing Soul Mass, Farron Hail, Crystal Hail. But you do get some spells that you get in Dark Souls 3 compared to the other Dark Souls games that are actually good, like Farron Flash Sword. This one is actually very nice to have, very FP efficient. And this spell alone could be the reason why you actually can do a pure casting type of playthrough, because you can just use this spell to just clean up trash mobs. But I think the biggest reason as to why Dark Souls 3 sorceries get over Dark Souls 2 is because Pestilent Mist exists, and this spell does percentile damage over time, of which you don't even need to actually go spec into any intelligence. You can just use this spell, and all enemies that have larger amounts of health will just get shredded. But also to mention, this game also did add Frost as a status effect, so you actually can use something like Snap Freeze, which a lot of enemies in this game can actually be frostbitten, which is just going to result in them taking more damage and taking a chunk damage too. And being that hexes aren't a thing in this game, all the dark-based spells got split up between all the spell types, so you actually get a bunch of really good dark spells, which dark damage in Dark Souls 3 is not that good. A lot of enemies are very resist, but if you do go up against those enemies that are resist to magic, you can actually use these things. And Great Soul Dregs is probably going to be your highest damaging one, even though it does require you speccing into Faith and Intelligence. But if you're just going to have a regular Intelligence build, Soul Spear, Crystal Soul Spear, Soul Stream, these are going to be your bread and butter. These things do so much damage and just melt bosses extremely quickly. And for me, my personal favorite spell, Old Moonlight. I know this list is not going to take fun into account, but every single time that we talk about the sorceries, I just gotta mention Old Moonlight. It's just so fucking cool. And it's not like it performs poorly. At point blank range, this thing can just do stupid damage. You can fully charge it as well. And this thing is such a badass spell. Number 5, Dark Souls 1 sorceries. Now this is where we get into like the S tier. These are like the cream of the crop, broken ass spell types. You can like rearrange this top 5 and I wouldn't even be mad. But to start off with, Dark Souls 1 sorceries are just stupid because you get lots of casts. They all do such amazing damage. They don't even take that long to cast either. And like every single spell just shreds. Normally you have like a bunch of like mediocre spells. Nope. Sorceries, every single one is just high damaging and can just destroy things. Soul Arrow, Heavy Soul Arrow, Soul Mass, Soul Spear, even White Dragon Breath. Everything just shreds. And even when you get later into the playthrough, it might end up being bad. The game's like, nope, don't worry. Here, take these spells instead. The Dark Sorceries, the Hexes, whatever you want to call them, these things are just absolutely broken. Mainly it's just Dark Bead and Pursuer's Dark Orb and Dark Fog aren't that good. But yeah, Dark Bead, this thing is like probably one of the best spells that Fromsoft has ever made. This thing is so incredibly fast. You get a decent amount of cast and it is like 2 or 3 shots like almost every single boss plus in the entire game, especially if you pair it alongside the Mana's Catalyst. Which another good thing about Dark Souls 1 spells in general is that you don't have to like upgrade anything. None of your catalysts require to be upgraded, and using the spells don't consume any stamina, which is like part of the reason why this Dark Souls 1 spells are just stupid. But yeah, the only downside of these dark based spells is that you can't get Pursuers and the Mana's Catalyst in the same playthrough because they both require Manus' Soul, which is kind of annoying, so you have to get like one or the other in New Game Plus. But not that it matters because you can just spam Dark Bead the entire time. And also you can just couple this with like the regular sorceries that you do get, and like everything in the entire game is just gonna get deleted. It just does not matter. Number 4, we have Dark Souls 1 Pyromancies, and yeah, these things are just also very broken. Dark Souls 1 sorceries might just end up performing better in terms of just damage, because like obviously things like Dark Bead exist, but the reason as to why Dark Souls 1 Pyromancies are so broken is because they don't scale with anything, and you can still do such ridiculous amounts of damage. All you gotta do is just level up your Pyromancy Flame, and then you just instantly have just like one-shotting potential, which is just ridiculous. Now, it does require a bunch of souls, which it might end up taking a little bit to actually end up maxing out your Pyromancy Flame, but you could easily get it before you even kill Ornstein and Smo. And with how easy it is to actually duplicate souls in this game with a glitch, yeah, these things are just going to be an absolute menace to deal with. There's like no stats that need to be upgraded at all, maybe except dexterity, because unfortunately your casting speed scales off dexterity, which I don't know why that's still a thing. That should just go back to like attunement and mind, please. Like how it was in Dark Souls 2, please game, Fromsoft, make it happen. But the funny thing is about the casting speed in Dark Souls 1, the spell type that actually benefits the most is Pyromancies. Going into dexterity and trying to get faster casting speeds with miracles and sorceries, you're not going to get much of a benefit. You get like 20% faster casting speed when you go to 45 dexterity. But yeah, to talk about the spells themselves, every single one is just like very high damaging. Great Chaos Fireball just like destroys things. Chaos Storm just destroys things. Great Combustion, everything destroys things. It just doesn't matter. The only like spells that are kind of like mid, I guess, will be like Poison Mist and Toxic Mist, because like everything is like immune to poison in this game. And if you're going up against enemies that are like more resist to fire damage, you could just use Black Flame, which does like part physical damage, although I still wouldn't really recommend using it. And also to mention, Power Within is a spell that exists, which can honestly just make any single build viable, because this just improves your damage and defenses by so much. And obviously the fact that it doesn't scale with anything, you could just use this with any build and it's going to be a buff, so you don't even need to upgrade your Pyromancy Flame. Number 3, Elden Ring Sorceries. Yes, Elden Ring was bound to get higher on the list, and with the sorceries, there's obviously plenty of variety of spells. There are so many things to choose from, which means there's lots of trash, but there's lots of broken stuff too. You can like accidentally make a broken build. And you have something for like everything, honestly. You can just pick one spell that's really good and you can beat the game incredibly easy with that spell. You want something for close range? Carrion Slicer. There you go. This spell just like destroys everything and is arguably better than like almost every single weapon in the entire game. If you didn't like the range of Carrion Slicer, you can use Carrion Piercer. That shit works too. If you don't want to be at melee range, you want to be at a distance, here, use Night Comet or Comet. These spells just do ridiculous damage. You can fully charge them, which is something that you actually can do in this game compared to all the other games. You can also walk around while using them too. But what if you don't want to walk around and have to strafe attacks and dodge? Go ahead and use something like Comet Azure or Meteorite of Estelle. You can just beat bosses without even moving. You can just hold onto the one button. And what if you're fighting enemies that are like really resist to magic? Then you can go ahead and use something like Magma Shot or Rock Sling. You want to proc Frost so you can actually debuff enemies and do more damage? We got something for that too. You feel like you're lacking your magic damage? Here's another spell, Terra Magica. That's 35% more magic damage. You still feel like you're lacking a little bit more damage? Here's like 1,000 buffs that can just help you just do ridiculous damage and also just not consume any types of FP also. There you go, just use whatever you want to. Like everything is gonna work, it doesn't matter. Number 2, Demon Souls magic spells. Yeah, compared to like the miracles from Demon Souls, this is like complete night and day. They just like stole all the good stuff and left miracles with like the scraps. They even took like the damage negation stuff. Like how are you gonna have the magic spells have damage negation and have all the damaging spells? Shit's insane. But yeah, anything that you really use with the magic spells when it comes to the damaging based options, you can't like really go wrong. Doesn't matter which ones that you use. The magic ones, the fire ones, they're both gonna be broken. The fact that you actually get 2 damage types in itself is kind of already silly. But yeah, to talk about the spells themselves, there's not many, but every single one is just ridiculous. Soul Ray just goes incredibly far, goes through enemies. Homing Soul Arrow tracks towards enemies and just does stupid damage. Firestorm, there's not even like a word to describe how much damage this does. Catastrophic maybe? Nuclear? I don't know. It does a lot. Like the only downside I could probably say about these damaging spells is that you can't really get all of them in like regular new game. Like, not that it really matters. Like, as soon as you pick up some of these things, it's basically just a GG. Like, even the worst options are still still good. Like Fire Spray is still good, Flame Toss, Ignite. These are all very useful spells that can still perform extremely well. And the funniest thing about all this, and probably the most broken part, is that your Catalyst already comes fully maxed out. You don't have to upgrade your Catalyst at all. The shit doesn't consume any types of stamina. So basically every single attack you can just keep on spamming forever and ever. It does take up mana, and to regenerate your mana, you're gonna have to buy some spice, but the spice is so incredibly cheap in this game that you can just constantly keep casting over and over again. And best of all yet, there is no soft cap for the magic stat. There's no soft cap. You can just keep going all into magic and there'll be no damage fall off. You go all the way to 99 if you want to, and you'll benefit just as much with every single point. It's actually stupid. And magic spells also gets all of the weapon buffs too. Light weapon, curse weapon, which is as good with every single build. Anytime where you can buff your weapon, you would use one of these two, and it just makes even melee builds broken. Yeah, these things are just like amazing. And at number 1, we have the Elden Ring Incantations. Like when I mentioned that the Sorceries have like everything that you need, the Incantations have like everything that you need times 10 and then some. An easy to use spell that's going to be better than like almost every single weapon in the entire game. Look, here's Catch Flame. You can use this. You want an entire spell type that can scale off Arcane and just do ridiculous damage? Here's the Dragon Communion spells. Every single one is broken. If that's not enough and you actually want to one-shot the bosses instead, you can use Ancient Dragon's Lightning Strike. This one can work perfectly fine for you. But it doesn't just end there. You get good sniping spells, good percentile damage over time spells that are going to be really good even in New Game +7, bleed-based spells, and even your support spells are just broken. You want a health regen spell? Here's Erdtree Heal. It's going to heal you for like 3000 HP in like 2 seconds. And don't worry, it also heals your Spirit Summon too if you actually need him to be at full health. And if that wasn't enough and you need some more buffs, you can use things like Flame Grimmy Strength or Golden Vow. Things they could just use and benefit off every single type of build, and they can also buff your allies too. And if you didn't want to use damaging buffs, you could just use damage negation spells instead. You don't like how the boss is doing too much damage? That's perfectly fine. Here you go. Here's like 70% damage negation. So yeah, it just gets everything, and everything is just broken when it comes to the Incantations. There's so many buffs in this game that could just make all these spells just so overpowered. You can like fully charge some of these spells. There's like, yeah, you can't really ever go wrong when you go with an Incantation type build. Anyway, that is in fact the list. As always, let me know what your opinions are down in the comments. I think the next video I'm probably going to make will be ranking all of the katanas. I did just finish a katana marathon, so I'm guessing we're going to rank all the katanas across all the Souls games. That'll be cool, so definitely subscribe for that. And do follow me on Twitch as well, because that's where I do all of my challenge runs, and I'm live there every day doing a bunch of this stupid random stuff. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye!